Hey all, this was a little bit too long for a single episode, but not quite long enough to be two full parts that we release on 2 separate weeks. So we split this up into 2 parts, and we're just going to release both at the same time for people who are not cool guys like me who sit in basements all day and listen to podcasts while working. So this is part 1. Hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, welcome to Neighbor Science, the only podcast about political economy and anime. I am Ryan Salisbury.
I'm Chris Nivens.
Today, first of all, I just want to get this out of the way. I ran some calculations today, and assuming that listener growth continues at a fixed rate, which I'm pretty sure is a safe assumption, you know.
Yeah.
Growth rates don't usually change.
Yeah, 3/4 of a person per week or something.
Right. Yeah, so assuming that happens, we will be making Chapo money on the Patreon in only 9,400 years.
How many?
So,
9,400
thanks to all our subscribers.
That's not bad. That's not bad. You know, how many? So, how many Chapos are we worth right now? That's 1/9,400th.
Yeah,
basically,
something like that.
Is that basically what we're looking at? Yeah. So, like, kidnap your friends.
Yeah.
Kidnap your relatives.
Yeah. Steal your grandma's credit card. Put her credit card on the Patreon.
Yeah. You know, she won't even notice.
We will be putting the money into anarchist investments.
Hell yeah.
I'm already looking at sale cargo, which we talked about in the pre-show for the Patreon. Which, goddamn, I need to put all those outtakes and pre-show things up.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, people are paying us, so I should definitely do that. But
yeah.
I get done with the editing for the show, and I'm just like, I'm going to the bar now.
Yeah,
that's what I always do every time. Okay, so today we are talking about we're continuing our series on thalassocracy and domination through maritime trade with the
Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie.
The Dutch East India Company.
Close. Yeah. I mean, it's like if an English person, if an English person and a German person got like really fucking trashed together, you know, and then tried to speak between like makeout sessions, then that's how you get Dutch. Yeah.
Hold on.
Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie.
Verenigde. Yeah, that's way too hard for me to pronounce.
Oost-Indische Compagnie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also a word, I thought it was Gilders, but apparently it's Heilders.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely not even going to try pronouncing any of these fucking Dutch words. So we're going to call it the VOC. That's the initials in Dutch. And again, it's known in English.
Fuck you.
Again, it's known in English as the Dutch East India Company.
Yes.
So the VOC is probably the most studied business in history. I think it just is the most studied business in history.
Basically.
Yeah. Which makes it both easy to find information on, but difficult to decide which information to read and talk about. So it's kind of an overwhelming topic. It's kind of like I tried to do an episode on the EU, and that's what it was like, except the information isn't so like readily available.
Right.
So this was just like a fucking blast to the skull of stuff. Like, just go on the Wikipedia article for that, and it's insane.
It's just like you could make a career out of other people's careers that were made on other people's careers about studying this shit.
Yeah. There's studies that are crazily specific on this topic. So I hope that we picked out some good info on this, trying to just cover, you know, what it is, what they did, what it was like, how they formed, how they fell, that kind of thing. So the VOC was a corporation. Hold on. I skipped a part. It's also one of the best pieces of evidence to support our understanding of business as equally constitutive of the state as government. I don't know if that doesn't make sense, but you know, business as part of the state, an equal part of the state. Oh, as government is. Okay, that makes sense.
Yes. Yes.
So the VOC was a corporation, hardly different from those of today, other than in scale, and it also functioned as a de facto state, which, like, even among those who don't have the same opinion on business as us, they acknowledge that the VOC functioned as an actual state.
Yep.
So it had its own military forces, which wasn't totally uncommon prior to the 20th century, but you know, today obviously the U.S. is such a world-dominating force, and so in favor of corporations that there's like no point in having your own military force.
Yeah.
Unless you're mercenaries for the U.S. government,
right?
Like Blackwater / XE / Academy / whatever the fuck they're called now.
Yeah, all those motherfuckers.
Yeah, Eric Prince's fiefdom.
And guess where Eric Prince's ancestors are from?
The Netherlands.
The Netherlands.
Sweet.
How interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on top of military forces, the VOC also had prisons. It issued its own coinage. It negotiated international treaties. And its purpose was to manage colonies, so it possessed its own colonies. I think it had legal ownership of them, and it basically just like gave its resources to the Dutch state because that's who was paying it and chartering it.
Yeah, I think it was like, because I don't have again, this shit is complicated and deep, and there's like you could like sink entire decades of your life into studying the VOC. But yeah, like what you're saying is similar to my understanding, which is that the VOC was basically a much freer, kind of like a shell corporation within the shell of the Netherlands as a state. And so it was kind of ensconced in the state, and like they more or less traded freely between them. Yeah,
and it was almost more like it was more like a modern technocratic state because
basically
at that point they definitely were still fully entrenched with monarchies in most places.
Yeah.
I think the French Revolution started prior to the VOC, right? I have no idea what the timeline is.
So,
what is that? Is that the 18th century?
Yeah. Okay. So like just to get people's heads straight on the chronology and to give us a little context.
This is hard when you haven't been in a history class for 10 plus years.
Yeah. I even had to brush up on it, even though this is like kind of my shit. But like, so the Protestant Reformation started. Protestant Reformations in Europe started, in like the 14th through 16th century. And so in the 16th to 17th century.
And that basically undermined the centralized power of the Catholic Church,
exactly,
right?
Right. And that was entangled with a variety of kind of continental European imperial powers.
Right.
Such as like the Habsburgs, which is relevant to the Dutch.
Yeah, they actually come up a lot in here, but we won't really
because the Habsburgs are themselves about a little bit like the VOC. They are in terms of like they take forever to really get into properly. They've been endlessly researched. Their descendants are still unfortunately alive and kicking, and
they still have that wicked underbite.
And they still, you can fucking. I looked at the fucking current like heads of house, and I was like, yeah, they look like fucking Habsburgs. It's insane.
God.
They look like like they're like
great.
slightly more photogenic, but
it's
they're
really
like,
cool.
Damn, there's a family resemblance because they're all fucking each other. Yeah, but
yeah, if you ever want to know the extent of how little social mobility there really is in the world, go look up rare surname studies.
Yep.
And they basically take people who have really unique last names and they track their social position over hundreds of years, like up to 1,000 years.
Yep.
And basically social classes are stable over at least 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So.
Until and unless you do that thing we like to talk about where you like get the Romanovs in a basement or something. But we don't have to talk about that tonight. That's not what we're about right now. But yeah, so like the European wars of religion came out of the conflicts between centers of power which supported Protestantism, which typically were in the north of Europe, because they saw the south of Europe, which was traditionally extremely Catholic because it was centered around Catholic centers of power and so forth.
And always clashing with Muslims, right?
Right, yeah. And so there was this Mediterranean thing as well as like this kind of like Italian and Spanish thing. And this is kind of where you get a lot of this like northern versus southern European shit.
Yeah.
And so like for example, like Martin Luther came about, if you will, he did his thing, and the Saxon kings in the north of Germany supported and protected him, and it became this whole tussle.
That's the other thing that's hard when you're reading about this is you always forget that most like modern countries in Europe are just like glommed together from kingdoms, like many smaller kingdoms that existed in Europe for prior to the modern age.
Exactly. And also, let me correct myself. I believe it was just lords at that point. I was thinking Saxon kings because I'm obsessed with like British history, for some weird reason. But yeah, so the Saxons and so forth, were like, oh, Luther's cool, we like his thing, and this is a chance for us to break away from like Southern power, right? And so forth and so on. So this eventually, right, these tensions and the like different affiliations and peasant revolts and other things eventually develop into conflicts between clusters of power, centers of power, affiliations and coalitions and so forth, as Protestantism becomes not just a protesting movement, but also a political movement and a political core.
Paid for by George Soros.
Paid for by George Soros. Exactly.
Paid Protestants by George Soros.
Yeah, Protestants were like the liberals of the day with a little flavor, and so... And
now they're the like arch reactionaries, which is fucking weird.
Yeah, exactly, because they got power.
Yeah.
They did well with that.
Yeah.
And so...
that kind of tempers my idea, doesn't it? Like, we need to just build power in any way we can, and then we'll just become the ruling class. Oops.
Exactly.
Well, we'll be nice.
Right. Yeah.
I promise.
We'll be nice.
I promise.
Those other guys. Yeah. So the issue of Protestant versus Catholic and Northern versus Southern kind of congealed, and you still see these patterns today.
Right. The South will rise again.
Well, in the States it was a little different, but yeah, in Europe,
I'm just a down-home country Catholic.
Exactly. So in Europe, you saw Catholic and sort of anti-Catholic lines drawn, but because the Hapsburgs, again, not to touch too much on them, the Habsburgs had holdings all over Europe, which sometimes were not even contiguous. And so forth. Then there were these like the Spanish Habsburgs held the Low Countries more or less, and the Netherlands became Calvinist. Right, and which is its own barrel of fun. But then along the way, they also decided, well, we don't want to be part of like this kind of Spanish Habsburg Empire thing, and so there was those wars. So the Dutch by the like early 17th century, so the early 1600s, were like kind of looking for some clout. They needed some fucking power, and they needed to do it quick, because the Spanish for hundreds of years, much like the French for hundreds of years, were just like a juggernaut, right? And they were only picking up steam because of their time in the New World, quote unquote, and their exploitation of the people there. So,
and by the way, we'll
get into some of this other history in a minute. But
one thing I read about the European Colonial Project is that part of it was, I don't know how true this is. I just read it in one of the books that I have. I don't even fucking remember which one. I think it might have been either The Invention of Capitalism by Perelman or The Rise of Free Trade Imperialism by Semmel, and basically, they were suggesting that the European colonial project was partly created out of a need to absorb excess capital. So they were like, they were building up all this capital at the time,
right?
And they started building up industry, and like basically they didn't have enough demand,
right,
for its level of industry, and so
they were getting blue balls,
right? So they basically established these colonies to like sell shit to the colonists, and also to obviously to get inputs for their industry as well.
Right. So. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So what you're saying is basically there was an excess of finance.
Yes.
And so they were like, well, where do we fucking what do we buy?
Right.
It's kind of it's the rich person's dilemma, right?
Right.
Like, what the fuck do we spend our money on at this point?
Right. Like the Bank of England was created to build the British Navy,
shunt it out,
and that's because they had the industry,
right?
But they didn't have the money that they needed, so they created an institution that could just like create a bunch of all this capital, and then the capital could be used to feed into the industry, to produce warships, to go to other places, to get more sinks for their outputs and sources for their inputs.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's like if you could like build an implant called a bank into your body that would turn all your excess fat into like instant muscle. and be like the scariest motherfucker alive.
Yeah. Be Hulk.
But then like incentivized by that, all you would ever do is just overeat and maybe even eat other people.
So you're trying to be Hulk, but then you turn into the Blob.
Exactly right. Like the Blob as Bane.
Yeah. All right. So the VOC was formed it was actually formed from 6 different companies. It was created out of a state charter. It was basically they had the idea that it would be less risky to conglomerate all these 6 different companies into one company, and it would be sort of managed by the state but independent as well.
Right. This is again. This is emblematic of the what you might call externalizing or like outsourcing. Actually, better term for it: outsourcing of risk, outsourcing of liability.
Yeah,
which embodies and informs capitalism today.
Right,
and they started right off the bat with that logic, and they like exploited that logic to the nth.
Yeah. So I'll get into the liability part right now. Then, so the VOC was one of the first limited liability companies. It was a company that offered stocks, which wasn't the first one of those. There were companies prior to that called joint stock companies, and basically the way those worked is someone would want to go on a sea voyage, and so they would sell stock in the journey, and it worked exactly like stock today. Right. You buy a share, and then whatever the returns are, you gain on your share of it. But the VOC did something a little different. They created, they offered limited liability. So in a joint stock company, if the voyage failed and you owed someone, if the venture had debts at the end of it, basically, then there would be no limit to the amount that you would have to pay the debt collectors. Whereas in a limited liability company, if you invest $1,000, then that would be the most that you owe. You would never have to pay for the company's debt. So if it went into debt, it would basically you'd like liquidate all its assets, and then that would go to the people you owe the debts to.
That seems sensible.
Yeah. And so that's how almost all corporations work today.
Yep.
Maybe all of them. I don't know. I'm not going to look that up.
Yeah, we'd have to look into that, but
yeah. So this structure, of course, is only possible with the support of the legal system. So again, this had to be a state creation.
Yeah.
There's no way to do it otherwise.
Yeah, exactly.
Because why would anyone agree to that unless they were just like a legal mandate, Right. I mean, obviously the investors would like that, but why would the people that would ostensibly be owed money if the venture failed want to do that? Exactly.
They would have to go into it knowing that this was a requirement, and the requirement would have to be enforced, and the enforcement would have to come from some external body.
Right.
And in this case, the external body was traditionally the state, which was traditionally essentially a military bureaucracy of sorts, essentially.
Yeah. So just an aside about the oldest known limited liability company, it's called Stora. It's a Finnish company, and it was formed in 1288 to mine copper, which is pretty wild.
Pretty old.
Yeah.
It's about as old as a lot of the oldest beers.
Hey. Yeah. So the share of the company from 1288, which is still preserved today, was granted to the Bishop of Västerås, and he was a bishop, like if you're a dumbass atheist like me, that's a religious person.
So a bishop.
At first, I thought it was like a feudal lord, and I looked up bishop, and I was like, oh no, it's like a church guy.
Yeah. A bishop is like a combination of a CEO and a mayor for the local church.
Yeah. So he had a share for 1/8 of this company, Stora.
Which is not bad.
Which still exists today, by the way. Yeah.
Does the bishop still exist?
Well, there is a
I'm curious.
A diocese of Västerås.
Yeah.
And so they do have a bishop still.
Huh.
So there's still technically a bishop of Västerås, but I'm assuming it's not the same guy.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah. I really
Unless
wonder.
he's doing the Peter Thiel treatment.
Yeah, right. just guzzling that blood. I'm really curious if the diocese or whatever, the parish, this church entity like still has that share, and,
I mean, it still exists.
And also
so
how
possible.
well they're doing, you know?
Yeah.
Are they collecting compounded interest?
They're like, we
what's
don't need
going on with
tithes, we
that?
got capital gains.
Right. Which I think was the point.
Yeah. So I think this is really interesting that a bishop has like such a large stake in a company and illustrative of how like the church might have exercised its power. That's one thing I'm still not that clear on is like, okay, the church was in control of society ostensibly, but how do they actually exercise that influence? Because, I mean, maybe it's just me not understanding religion at all, but to me, the idea that everything was controlled through like the sacraments just seems ridiculous to me. They're like, there's no fucking way that was the extent of it.
So the history of the church in Europe, like the Catholic Church or even the Orthodox Church, I guess, although I'm less familiar with that, the Catholic Church was a political institution. There were Christian churches locally, before, and there was a network of those churches pre-existing, and then the Catholic Church kind of like willed itself into being, because like this guy just one day was like, I'm the Pope, and they're like, but you're the bishop in Rome, and yes, you're very influential because you're in Rome, and he's like, nope, we're calling me the Pope now, and you can fuck yourself. So then the Orthodox guys were like, well, I don't really like that, we're gonna have a patriarch and we're gonna go with it, and this is like the Cliff Notes, and it's again extremely reductive because you know that I like to say long things about bad facts, but like but yeah, basically the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, it's astounding to me how fanatical people can be about it, because although at the same time it makes a lot of political sense, because they really just invented themselves. Yeah. And they were like, we're in charge now out of Rome. We have this hierarchy. They literally invented cardinals, right? Cardinals were just a fucking thing all of a sudden. Okay. It was basically like all my faves get to hang out in red. And
my top 8.
Yeah, exactly. My top 8, and most of the time...
That's a MySpace joke for you youngins.
and most of the time, they were favorites of the Pope, and also nobles, and also Italian, just like the Pope was often a noble and also Italian. So that happened.
He's noble, but also a Guido.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So these Guido nobles are running the church, and like that's become normal after 1,000 years. But like,
hey, have some of Christ's fucking blood, man.
Yeah, right.
Hey, you want his fucking body too?
I can't believe he's quitting after only 4 shots. Yeah, so like...
Hey, I'm going to take your baby and dip him in some fucking water. Isn't that weird? I'm getting into like a Boston accent now.
Yeah, right. And so the Catholic Church, and this is getting back into that and also prefacing like the existence of Protestantism, the Catholic Church, being this political thing, soon became not just sort of an extremely cynical political body of sorts, at least at the top, but then it became extremely corrupt. Okay. And that's actually what led to the Reformation a few hundred years later. Right. And that's what led to blah, 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 blah.
Indulgences
blah.
And all that
and so
stuff.
forth. Right.
Fun. Okay.
So Catholicism, as I think I put it in my notes, the Roman Catholic Church was constantly on the lookout for new sources of revenue because it could ideologically compel people to contribute to its operations, right? And it could then pay out. Again, it would profit while it also paid out in the form of monuments, in the form of like minor charities, right, and so forth.
I guess you also have to think that since they didn't have a business class, really, they had. I'm sure they had merchants, but they probably didn't exercise a very huge amount of influence at that point. So they were probably controlling the vast majority of money that was actually flowing through society. Yeah.
Merchants in the Middle Ages in Europe, as I understand it, were largely held in the same regard as they were in Japan.
So they were low class.
They were actually low class because, again, same logic. Yeah. They were not considered to be producing anything of especial use. Okay. They were simply facilitators, but it's all they ever did. And so people are like, well, they're whatever, and
Yeah.
like, yeah,
And
they
they were
do
kind of
get
like
rich,
adventurers,
but
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
But like, they're a bunch of fucking schemers, and like,
Yeah.
some of them are cool, but we don't really like them as a class, and so there was a lot of suspicion around them. Also, up until
I ran into one of them shiesty merchants today.
right, exactly. And so then when there's a bunch of like Semitic and anti-Semitic shit that came into that as well, but like that's a whole other topic that we should get into at some point.
Yeah.
Maybe another episode about like anti-Semitism and the means of distribution.
Right. We should get Jeremy Corbyn on that one.
Yeah. Hey, Jeremy. Hey, why don't you want to drink the blood? Yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff involved in this, but ultimately the Catholic Church, the institution or the organization, if you will, not like individuals so much, was like really interested in political power and the ability to mobilize force and the ability to mobilize ideological compulsion, which was their kind of specialty, as we've seen ever since they became a thing. And
that had to be where like all the cynical grifters were going to.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Well, they had to kind of compete with them or else absorb them.
Right.
You know.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's where we're at in this, I guess. So these Vasteros guys. The bishop had an eighth of the company. Right,
yeah. And so the company had a charter granted by King Magnus IV of Sweden, but not until 1347. So they were in operation for almost 100 years before, I guess 60 years, not that close, but 59 years they were in operation before they had an official charter, which is, I wonder how that worked. I guess they just... offered shares and
it might have been just like local arrangements, because they all knew each other, I would assume.
Yeah.
You know how like communitarian kind of shit tends to happen.
Yeah.
And let's just institutionalize this, put it on paper.
And so during the 17th century, because it was around that long, it's still around today again. I think it merged with another company, but I can't remember what its name was. But anyway, during the 17th century, the mine produced a huge proportion of the world's copper, up to 2/3 at some point.
2/3, holy shit!
Yeah. So they were a pretty influential company, and they were the earliest known limited liability company. That was a very large segue. Another modern characteristic of the VOC.
Getting back to the actual VOC,
was the fact that it was a persistent organization. So, like I mentioned earlier, with joint stock companies, they were literally funding one voyage. So they would say, "I'm going to go to the Spice Islands and pick up some cloves and come back." And so people would fund that one voyage, raise capital for it, send them over there, and then when they come back, the organization's assets would just be liquidated.
Right.
And it was extremely risky because obviously the voyage could fail. The ship could be sunk by storms or raided by pirates, or the crew could be killed off by disease.
Right. Very common.
Yeah. And even if it was successful, by the time they come back, the price of whatever they were trying to trade could have changed and made it unprofitable.
Could completely destroy the worth of the enterprise.
Right. Yeah. So it was extremely risky to get into any kind of joint stock company until the VOC came around, and they decided we're just going to form a persistent organization. We're going to have multiple voyages, and you're just going to be investing in the long-term health of the company.
Right.
So
this is basically where they began to enter into the business of the Phoenicians, tying back to our first episode on this, is that they're like, we're not just going to do one trip. We're going to actually establish a fucking route that we're in charge of, if we can, or a network even, if we're lucky,
So the VOC was involved in numerous trades. And by the way, I don't think we've mentioned this yet somehow, but they were mainly centered in Indonesia. That was like their colonial holdings. So they were involved in numerous trades, among them metals, shipbuilding, spices, sugarcane, silk, porcelain, metal. I put metals twice. Livestock, tea, grain, rice, soybeans, and wine. But I think it was mostly spices, though.
Yeah. The spices was like their trademark product. But let's go real quick over these products that we've listed. So metals are obviously important for like the reasons that I think we all understand because we live in this age.
I think much of it was precious metals, not necessarily like
so
iron.
Silver, gold, etc. Yeah.
Especially because, I mean, shipping is the cheapest mode of transportation, but it's still, structural metals are hard to move around.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not something they would probably be doing back then when they didn't have giant, humongous diesel-powered ships that could just like plow through ocean currents and not have to worry about anything.
Yeah. So metals are a big deal either way, but precious metals at the time, because of the mercantilist bent of the various European empires.
Yeah, they were obsessed with getting bullion.
Yeah, they wanted bullion. Silver and gold were really in demand.
Right.
So if the Dutch could actually procure that, then they could they could literally tell their former overlords, the Spanish, like, we have 300 tons of silver. Yeah. So, either suck my dick or die.
Yeah.
Yeah,
this was still before they realized that money was completely just fiat. Yeah. That the value of money was just created through state force, and that they didn't have to have like an actual backing to it.
Exactly.
Although I've heard an alternative hypothesis for why they would have used precious metals for coins, which is that if a government minted, or if someone minted coins, because there were private coins back then too. Right. If someone minted coins and the coin was debased and lost its value, then the metal that it was made of could be melted down and sold for some other form of currency. And so the people that invested, so to speak, in the coin wouldn't be out so much if it didn't work out.
Yeah, I think you're basically on the right track. Like, my perspective is similar. And again, this is all theory, people, so it's like, it's not really hammered down, because history is a lot shakier than most of us realize.
Actually, a theory is a scientific explanation that requires a substantial amount of evidence.
You're right. This
I used to be that guy in like 9th grade.
Yeah, exactly. That's fair, right? But okay.
Spent way too much time on talkorigins.com, which is like the that was the site to fact check anyone's claims about creationism. It's pretty great.
Nice. So instead of theory, I'll say this is my 3-beer salute. But basically, it was not only the ability to liquidate metals to create coinage or whatever, but you have to think about, if you have more of those metals which are used in a standard way, because silver and gold are more, well, gold in particular, right, does not rust or tarnish or anything like that. It's very malleable. It's extremely unique that way. And it doesn't poison you like mercury or something. But
it's the best material to make chains out of.
Yes. Yes. And then silver is pretty good too. It's not perfect, but it's pretty great.
That's when you're gold, and then when you're plat, you get gold.
Right. Exactly.
When you're triple plat, you get plat.
Yeah. then you get right. It's like the price of money,
you get wet,
Yeah, that's right. But basically, the control over the supply also means your control over your own ability to manipulate the currency. So it was like at the time when you couldn't necessarily just like fell 100,000 trees and pulp them and turn them into paper currency on the idea of fiat. And you couldn't obviously do digital credit or anything.
Right.
What you were going to do is you're going to have those physical coins. As
they had blockchain back then, but it was very slow.
Right. You
had to have a whole army of monks doing these calculations by hand,
just scribbling. Yeah,
and then one of them, you'd have this whole big room with like hundreds of them, and then once one of them finally solved one of the hashes for the next block, they would wave it up in the air, and then the bishop would come by and check their work.
Right.
And if it wasn't correct, they would get 40 lashes.
Yeah, exactly. Computing. If you liked that joke, you should read what's his name? Cheech and Lu's The ThreeBody Problem. No, not Cheech and Chong. The novel called The ThreeBody Problem, and the trilogy that it kicks off, because there's a lot of interesting like computing science fiction involved. Anyway, besides that, So yeah, the control over the ability to manipulate the currency was at the time very limited by material concerns, such as having alloys at your disposal. And so the more silver and gold you could have, in bullion,
you basically needed mines and slaves.
Yeah, you literally needed material in order to make the money, because those were the tokens by which you controlled labor.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you could control the control,
yeah,
that was the state's real concern.
And let's see. Since we're on the subject, let's just talk about the currency, because I have a whole section.
Let's do it
here.
We'll go back to the trade after that.
Okay, I'm gonna start with this part about seigniorage. So,
very important. Very important.
Yeah, seigniorage is the value of a coin above the raw material that it's made of. So all like viable quote unquote currencies have that. So value is a very ideological term. So I'll say that I specifically mean the amount of labor or political power that the coin can mobilize above the amount of labor or power needed to produce the coin. That's what seigniorage is. So all coins must have seigniorage for them to be worth issuing. So it would be pointless to bother issuing a coin unless you get more out of it than you put in. So the idea is I need a labor force that's bigger than what I can directly subjugate through like the people that are loyal to me.
Right.
So I'm going to create a coin, and then if anyone objects to not working for the coin, then I'll send the people that are loyal to me to go punish them for that.
Exactly.
And they'll be made an example of, and then other people will use the coin to avoid punishment.
Exactly.
So there are exceptions to this, such as the incredibly stupid situation in the U.S. where Big Zinc consistently prevents the U.S. government from getting rid of the penny, even though a penny won't buy the metal it's made of. But the rest of the U.S. currency has seigniorage.
Yep.
So prior to the modern age, where industry has few limits, in the medieval and ancient periods, the cost to issue coins was significant. So it was important that they last a long time. So one technique used to extend the lifespan of coins is called countermarking, which is just some sort of stamp on top of the coin's original stamp. A countermark could change the value of a coin or indicate that it's intended for use in a different location than where it was originally minted. So this doesn't happen at all anymore. I would say no, it doesn't really happen at all.
Not that
it's slightly different. Basically, like some countries would import coins from elsewhere.
Right.
There's situations like that where like Venezuela has U.S. dollars in use.
Yep.
But
that's very different.
I think it's different
because that has more to do with government power. To some
one,
extent.
The petrodollar.
Yes, the petrodollar.
And two, just the fact that the U.S. has control of these global financial organizations that mandate,
which is it's basically written
yeah.
into the Bretton Woods and shit. And everything that's come since, I should say.
Yeah, this was literally they would say, "Oh, we need coins, but we don't have any of our own." So they would like import, like Japan imported coins from China,
right?
Like we mentioned in
because
that
it was a practical concern and a practical solution. They're like, well, like you said, we don't have this physical
it wasn't so much. It wasn't so much a foreign state trying to exert their influence.
Right. It was like we need a physical supply that we can just remaster, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was like the action. It was the action of a weak state rather than the action of a strong state to subjugate a weaker state.
Exactly.
Yeah. The VOC used countermarking on coins produced in its territory, as well as on some foreign coins from Japan and India. The modern states of Japan and India to use for themselves. So I'm not sure if the practice of countermarking a locale's coins is a power grab or the outcome of one, or a combination. As in, like, the VOC had sufficient power to force the population to accept the countermarked coin already, but in doing so, they gained even more power over the people in the area.
That's a very interesting tactic. I think that's one of those things where, to my mind, it's sort of both. Like, it's the outcome of them having leverage enough, or some kind of maybe good fortune on their part to get enough coins and be able to enforce the countermarked value. That would then, the power grab is not so much in countermarking, but in the leverage that you gain by sabotaging the existing coin pool on the other side.
Okay.
Right?
And this is the dialectic.
Exactly. Exactly. And so it's the standard, like, if I cost you one, or if I win one, I cost you one. In a zero-sum situation, right? And so they're like, well, in these cases, it was more or less zero-sum beyond either party's ability to produce more coinage, right? But even then, they were sabotaging and eroding the other party's ability to counter their currency power, because they could literally seize half the coins of the other party, right? Let's just say theoretically, hypothetically, and then countermark those, even if it was just like sitting. And this is kind of common in those eras, and this is why privateers, pirates did this sort of shit. They would just seize like a box of fucking coins and be like, "These are ours now." Yeah, right. I'm rich now. And you're like, well, why? Because that's just their currency. No, in fact, I can countermark this, or I can trade this in like a third-party proxy, right, and get all sorts of fucking goods. So if they were able to seize and/or barter for a significant proportion of the other party's pool of currency, and then countermarket, then they controlled that currency. Yeah, like unit, by unit, you know. And then that other party had fewer pieces to deal with. And this was before the notion, I believe, of like inflation of a currency per se. Right. Because there wasn't this conceit of like a vast market in which everything has got like these limited parameters. Floating prices. Right, exactly. Yeah. It's like, no. You either have it or you don't. Right. Do you want to have a shootout, or do you want to just like give me more than what you were going to give me? Yeah. Because I have even more and even more and even more. Yeah. And this also kind of touches on one of the points in David Graeber's Debt, where he talks about like why would anyone ever use a coin over a credit system? Right. And one of his answers was because coins can be stolen. Yeah. And credit can't. Right. So, an upstart state could steal a bunch of coins and use those for itself. They could marshal other capacities than simple financial gaming. Right. So for the VOC, the company's directors in Amsterdam. I'm just reading from a Wikipedia article, so passage. So the company's directors sitting in Amsterdam adopted a unit of account system based on a notional. Heartland. I'm going to overdub that too. Divided into 20 notional stadhouders. This followed Dutch practice and reflected on the tendency for coins to get debased over time, and hence the nominal value of a given weight of silver to increase. The Rijksdaalder, with 25 points, who cares how much silver it has, was declared the Dutch national coin in 1606 and valued at 47 stadhouders. A rate increased to 48 stadhouders in 1608. The stadhouders and 2 stadhouders coins had a slightly different silver weight. Blah blah blah. In practice, the Rijksdaalder proved less desirable than the better-known Spanish Ocho Real coin, and as the Rijksdaalder contained more silver, they disappeared from circulation. So people melted down the Rijksdaalders for silver, and then used the Spanish Ocho Real. Because of this competition over currency supply and bullion. Right, exactly. So as a result, the VOC shipped the Spanish Ocho Real in large quantities, and it was the standard large coin of the Indies, used in official transactions and given the same 48 stiver value as the Rijksdaalder. So they might have countermarked that one. Okay, yeah. But it doesn't say. Okay. So we were just talking about metals and currency, and like kind of how at that time metals were really important to currency, which was important to the state's control over things like labor. Yeah. Among other things that we're more familiar with. Mobilizing other organizations. Yeah, exactly. And how metals were kind of the medium of fungibility, as you might say, between currencies. So the next thing on our list that we're kind of reviewing for products they traded, services they traded, which we really wanted to just like hit on a few of them because
Because they got huge canes.
They got huge. Yeah. And like these days we think about these things, and because we're in this global capitalist system where a lot of these things are just part of the network, part of the system, we don't think about it too much.
Yeah.
And so we don't necessarily recognize, even if we know they're important, we don't recognize exactly the...
We kind of project our daily life backwards. And
yeah.
Like, we don't think about the fact that people weren't getting their daily needs met through the market.
Right, exactly.
The market was for specific things.
Exactly. Yeah. And how in the old days, for
William
example...
Gillis. Fucking dipshit. Okay, so
moving on. So metals and currency, blah, blah, blah. So shipbuilding was another one on their list. That's inherently obvious why that would be important.
Yeah, they have to do that.
Right. So they have to get good at it. They have to do it for themselves. Suddenly they're like, well,
by the way, invest in sail cargo.
Sell it to others.
You're looking for an investment.
Yeah. We could sell space. We could sell the ships themselves. We could help others as contractors. We could help them build their own. After that, in our list, we have spices. So before we get to spices, because it's a big fucking deal, it's like the crux of this entire thing, I'm just going to go sugarcane, silk, porcelain. Sugarcane. Okay.
Is that from South America, or did it come from somewhere else?
Oh, shit. I can't remember, but we know, obviously...
Brazil's a big source, right?
Yeah, anybody who's studied colonialism has understood sugarcane as something that ended up mostly in the South American and Caribbean region and was a major source of A, wealth for European owners, and B, horrific slave trade and slave treatment. And sugarcane itself, I grew up in a sugarcane producing region. It's delightful, but it's hard to harvest. It's a little brutal on your hands and back. And so forth, but it's also basically pure sugar in a shaft, right? Which is my porn name. But after that is silk, which the Chinese made and almost nobody else, and so it was both rare and high quality and
fireproof.
Virtue of those, right. And it was also exotic in that kind of annoying.
And it feels nice.
It was just from where else, Yeah, it feels nice. You can make beautiful things with silk.
Kimonos.
Yeah.
Probably some other stuff.
Yeah, like you could weave these intricate designs into silk that you couldn't with other fabrics, or that would just be like, it would take years of your life to do. Similarly...
You can do the Diva Curl system. You have to have a silk pillowcase, though.
Yeah. A little more difficulty there. Mm-hmm. Which, of course, leads to more value in the market, if you will. So then you also have porcelain, similar story, same basic origins.
Yeah.
Also difficult to make, kind of a secret. Silk and porcelain both were kind of trade secrets as well. After that, we have also like livestock, tea, grain, rice, soybeans, wine, all these like organic foodstuffs. So rice, yes, came from more or less Asia. Mm-hmm. Soybeans came from more or less Asia. Wine, question mark. You could get it from Europe. Obviously, there's a lot of good European wine, but I think that the fact that they got more wine from elsewhere, and wine does often have a bit of an origin story attached to what you're drinking. Yeah. So there's that too. So like silk and
maybe
porcelain.
We're even getting like Huangju and sake.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, this is fucking great.
Yeah.
I haven't had this before.
Right.
Grain, like rice, just...
Maybe even fermented yak's milk from Tibet.
Holy
Who knows?
shit, right? little pink milk. And then tea is fantastic. You love tea.
Yes.
I love tea, but I don't love tea the way that you love tea. Right? Like,
I do, yeah. Yeah, let's just leave it at that.
We'll just leave it at that. Yeah. I don't need you to like start rubbing your chest or anything.
Well, I'm already jacking off, so.
Yeah.
Chris has turned the other way. You can't tell because we're on microphones.
Right.
He's just turned his whole body around.
The windows are fogged.